My name is Matt McTaggart. I'm a member of the CSPC program committee, and on behalf of the CSPC, I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome to conference session 279, Impact Assessment in Canada, New Opportunities in Social and Human Sciences for Reaching Canada's Sustainable Development Goals, excuse me, organized by the University of King's College. Before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Please turn off your videos and microphones for the duration, except for in the breakout rooms. Please also note that this session will be recorded. The discussion inside the breakout rooms will not. Please don't forget to tweet about your favorite events and panels at the conference, tag @SciencePolicy, and use the hashtag CSPC2020. And just shortly, I'll be adding a link to a short survey in the chat. It'll only take a minute or two to fill out, but it will really help us to improve the conference for future years, especially as we're navigating through this new online medium. So without any further ado, I'm now going to pass things over to Dr. Miriam Padolsky, the moderator for this session.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Matt. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this important session today. So my name is Miriam Padolsky. I'm the Director of Science Policy at the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. So before we get into the presentations, I wanted to start by acknowledging that based here in Ottawa, where I am, I'm joining the conference from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. And I encourage all of you as you participate in the session to reflect on the territories on which you are gathered for our session today. So I'm pleased to introduce our 4 speakers, and I'll just tell you quickly who they are. You can look at their bios on the conference site for more information, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the rundown of the session. So our speakers today are Dr. Ian Stewart. He's an Associate Professor of History of Science and Technology at University of King's College. We have Dr. Cheryl Chetkiewicz. She's a conservation scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society. As well, we have Steve DeRoy. He's a director and founder of the Firelight group. And last but not least, we have Dr. Gwendolyn Blue, who's an associate professor of geography at the University of Calgary. So I was asked to moderate this session today in light of Canada's new impact assessment legislation, the Impact Assessment Act, that came into force a little over 1 year ago. And that new legislation broadened the scope of federal assessments in Canada. So in our previous legislation, which focused on environmental effects, the new legislation has a broader scope, including assessing positive and negative health, social, and economic effects, as well as other factors such as impacts on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so this broader scope really highlights the importance of social sciences and humanities in undertaking these assessments. And another key feature of that legislation is assessing a project's contribution to sustainability. So our topic today is really relevant to the work that we do at the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. And I would like to thank the panelists for coming together to discuss these issues today. So as I mentioned, we have our 4 speakers. They're each going to speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we're going to have breakout groups to have further discussions. So you're going to be asked to select which breakout group you want to join. And the conference organizers have said that the easiest way to indicate which breakout group that you want to join is by just changing your name in the Zoom. So if you click on your image of your own sort of video, you'll see 3 dots appear. And if you click on that, you can click on rename. So you can just keep your name, but put a number in front of it. So if I wanted to join session 1, I would put 1 Miriam Padolsky. If you don't select, the organizers will just assign you to a breakout group, but we wanted to give you that chance to choose the topic or the presenter that you most wanted to engage with after the plenary session. So the numbers will be reflected in the order that the speakers go. So Dr. Ian Stewart is number 1, Dr. Cheryl Chetkiewicz, number 2, Steve DeRoy, 3, and Dr. Gwendolyn Blue, 4. So you can just keep that in mind and be thinking about which group you want to join for the breakout groups. We'll have about 20 minutes for the breakout group, and then we'll reconvene to hear final thoughts from each speaker. So that's an overview of how the session will run. And now I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Ian Stewart.
You're muted, Ian. You need to unmute.
Yeah, I was asking you whether the audio is okay, and Steve was going, no. So welcome everybody to this panel. Before I begin, let me say I'm speaking from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. I'm glad to be back at the CSPC after a few years of missing this conference. And as the kickoff presentation for this panel, I want to offer an overview of impact assessment from my perspective as a historian and philosopher of science and as a science policy scholar, and to share my perspective on impact assessment going forward in Canada. My interest in impact assessment comes from my judgment that it's a vital space within which some rather important aspects of science policy get put into practice. In my view, impact assessment for any political jurisdiction or industrial sector is a kind of litmus test, both of the quality of our institutions of knowledge and how those institutions support processes of deliberative democracy for the sake of our sustainable futures. So what is impact assessment? Some of us know it as formerly known as the environmental impact assessment or environmental assessment, EAs. It's a planning tool for sound decision-making regarding whether and how to proceed with a development, a natural resource project, an urban infrastructure that might alter, for better or for worse, a socio-ecological system. In Canada, impact assessment is either a federal or provincial or territorial jurisdiction, and it's sometimes both. Provincial and territorial impact assessments are usually overseen by environmental departments or boards, such as the Nunavut Impact Review Board. And at the federal level, the lead agency is the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, which operates now under new legislation, as Dr. Padolsky said, since August 2019. Social ecological systems is a term increasingly used in many fields of environmental governance, for example, and it recognizes that many of the deepest challenges, including within applied STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, these involve complex determinations that are simultaneously about people as much as about pine trees, about municipalities as much as about microbes, about oligarchies as much as about oil sands. This is about the coupled and inseparable character of people and place. This is true at the level of major initiatives of determining the character of our changing world, such as international initiatives at the level of the IPCC on climate change, which is perhaps the most famous example of a social ecological system. But it's also true, and perhaps especially true, for determining the impact on people and their supporting ecosystems at local levels when considering a pipeline construction project, a mine, an urban redesign, a forest clear cut, or a pulp mill effluent relocation. This panel honors the theme of science and society, in particular, the contribution of the social and the human sciences to the central topics of science policy, such as the role of scientific knowledge and governance in social well-being, and as reflected in the title of the talk, Canada's Sustainable Development Goals. It also reflects the fact that Canada has changed its vocabulary, as Dr. Padolsky mentioned, in its approach to impact assessment, to reflect the complex interdependencies of people and place, whose collective impacts are the subject of impact assessment, hence the change of name from Environmental Assessment Agency to the Impact Assessment Agency. This new act significantly amended the previous CAA of 2012 under the Harper administration to broaden the scope of what impact means, to include a deeper consideration of cultural and societal impacts. But it also amended what is meant by assessment, giving more time and conceptual space for allowing for engagement of potentially impacted communities and other stakeholders to take part in the knowledge generating and deliberative process that are impact assessments at their best. Why impact assessment at the CSPC 2020? Well, in the most obvious way, it has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. Why? Because sustainable development is present in sustainable development as it appears in the 17 well-known Sustainable Development Goals adopted internationally. It draws attention or involves at every point questions related to how we measure the impact, for example, of human developments, including industrial natural resource developments. In Canada, the new Impact Assessment Act has opened up possibilities of relevance of the social and human sciences for thinking about sustainable development at the level of impact assessment. And also under the theme of science and policy, the theme of equity, diversity, and inclusion is a central aspect of much of what we think about in the social sciences and humanities when it comes to impact assessment. There are 5 main stages of impact assessment, from planning to the impact statement produced by a proponent, by the impact assessment process, which is at the core of the deliberative, particularly the scientific aspect of impact assessments. And then there is the decision-making process and the post-decision. All the way along, many people are involved: the proponent, government, regulators, the agency, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, particularly those in place who bear most of the risks of impacts, negative impacts, and one hopes, ideally, the positive benefits. Impact assessment has expanded the opportunities for pluralities of knowledge, input, and of deliberative energy all the way along the way of this 5-stage process. The exception, of course, is at the level where the decision is made by the elected person, the minister, or the governor and council, ministers, or the governor and council, who must use a public interest determination. Who is the public or the publics? Whose interests matter most? This is profoundly a political decision in the small p sense of political, in terms of determining the public good. But impact assessment is a kind of nexus point of robust knowledge exchange. STEM fields, social science and humanities fields, local wisdom traditions, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. It is simultaneously a process that invariably weds together science, understood as knowledge generally, and politics in the sense of the pursuit of the public good. Across Canada, can we do better with impact assessment? Can we give better voice to those pluralities of knowledge, input, and deliberative energy in our impact assessment processes? Can we do a better job of connecting people to place? Can impact assessments be opportunities rather than impediments to sustainable development? And can social science and humanities scholars help? Impact assessments, as overseen by the federal agency, are going on across the country. Those blue dots are taken from a map from the Impact Assessment Agency's registry. And all of these are about, at every one of those points on the map, Sustainable Development Goals come into play. For this reason, I have the great pleasure of co-directing a pan-Canadian project funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, along with my colleague and partner, Dr. Deborah Davidson from the University of Alberta. And we want to ask in this federal project, which will go for 3 years, how can we bring together Canada's scholars from diverse social science and humanities fields into dialogue with those people who for years have been working tirelessly outside of academia as impact assessment specialists, and sometimes within academia. And we're doing so by looking at some critical case studies on impact assessment theory and practice from the past, looking at oil and gas development, northern mining, and the development of blue economy resources in Atlantic Canada. But we also want to build a dynamic and evolving IT-enabled network for connecting academics, practitioners, and communities. We want to build a network which will have a presence on the web. This will be the website. It's not yet, it's in development, So it's not yet live, but it's a domain will be called NADIA, Network for Expertise and Dialogue on Impact Assessment. And we want to essentially create a space online to bring together people from various kinds of walks of life and of kinds of knowledge expertise, and hopefully bringing out of the woodwork as well Canada's social science and humanities scholars, who all have extremely important impacts and things to say about impact assessment, even though they may not be necessarily identify themselves as scholars within the field of impact assessment. So I'm going to turn the rest of the discussion over now to my co-panelists, who will all bring together excellent perspectives from their own fields of expertise on impact assessment, and to bring out aspects of how impact assessment is more than simply the kinds of knowledge generated by the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So over to you, Cheryl. How did I do for time, Miriam?
Excellent. You had 1 minute left to go, so that was perfect.
Right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And if you want to learn more about the initiative, please join me in the room in my breakout session afterwards.
Thanks very much, Ian. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. So I'm calling in from Edmonton, Alberta, which is founded in Treaty Number 6 territory and is the homeland of the Plains, the Wood Cree, the Nakota, the Saulteaux and Dene people, and Métis Region Number 4. The land I'm describing in my talk is Treaty Number 9, where the Anishinaabe and Cree nations have taken care of the lands, waters, fish, and wildlife for millennia. And it's through my work as a scientist working to engage with First Nations that I learn about other worldviews, understandings of our relationships to nature, and where possible work with First Nations to co-produce the best knowledge available to take care of the land. And that includes in impact assessment. So just to orient you, the area that I'm focusing on for this presentation, the southern boundary is essentially the northern limit for industrial forestry tenures in Northern Ontario. The north is bounded by the world's largest inland sea, or the Hudson's Bay, and it represents 42% of the province of Ontario. And it's defined as a subarctic environment in which we have two major ecozones, the Hudson's Bay lowlands along the coast, and then the interior boreal shield. And it's these two ecozones that set both the context for what happens in those regions, but also the futures and the trajectories for the ecological, social, and economic visions for that place. Oh, there we go. First mistake. Anyway, the Ring of Fire refers to a variety of mineral deposits in the heart of the region, and it's approximately 535 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay, which is on the northern shore of Lake Superior, and Thunder Bay itself is about 2 hours away from Ottawa in a plane. So the area is remote, it has no permanent infrastructure, and it's been called one of the most promising mineral development opportunities in Northern Ontario in perhaps a century. Estimates suggest that there are about 100 years of chromite production in this region and significant levels of nickel, copper, and platinum, and it's defined by approximately 5,000 mineral exploration claims at this point. However, as we all know, viable mines rely on having good prices for minerals, and this hasn't been a particularly economically viable area for a number of years now. That said, the Ring of Fire is actually in the heart of some of the world's largest intact ecosystems. Some of these are globally significant. The far north includes the largest intact boreal forest, for example, left in the world. The Hudson's Bay lowlands is the third largest wetlands in the world, the largest in North America, and the second largest peatlands globally. The 5 of the 12 remaining undammed and unregulated watersheds in North America south of 55 degrees occur in Northern Ontario, and yet there's been limited scientific research in this region, with perhaps most of it focused on the last 2 decades. We have little or no commitments to monitoring of terrestrial and aquatic systems. We did have some of that a couple of decades ago, and we have few policy tools for protection. And at this point, there's limited provincial support for Indigenous-led planning or conservation. Perhaps what we do know most about is some of the species in the region. Some of those are deemed at risk by federal and provincial jurisdictions, and some of them are cultural keystones like lake sturgeon. But we have few examples of where community interest or concerns about these species have been included in a meaningful way in policy, possibly outside of species at risk research. And there's limited experience in this region of working with communities to learn more about these species, and few folks that can actually consider different kinds of knowledge systems and how we braid that knowledge versus integrating it into science. And there's a limited number of community-based research and monitoring initiatives with funding, capacity, and variations in approaches that are also occurring in this region. The area is really important for ecosystem services, particularly for carbon regulation and freshwater provisioning. Yet these services remain invisible in environmental policy, and they do not figure into decision-making. There are some opportunities to think about protection of these services, particularly through Indigenous protected areas, but that's been largely driven by federal funding at this point, and it has been pretty absent in terms of the provincial policy frameworks. The provisioning of fish, wildlife, medicines, fresh water, and plants are also treaty rights and remain poorly considered in impact assessment and, to the most part, in land use planning in the region. So this is not an empty space. There are 40,000 people living in 34 communities, 31 of which are remote and accessible only by air. The relationships between these communities and Ontario and Canada are defined by Treaty Number 9, which has been presented as a land surrender by Ontario and the federal government, but a sharing agreement in most cases from the perspective of First Nations that live in the region. And most communities, as we may be aware of, are in some state of social emergency, not only from COVID-19, but more recently, as some of you may have known, the Shkandiga First Nation was recently evacuated due to the lack of clean water facilities. And this is on top of the 25 years of boil water advisories in these remote communities. That said, the relationship to land is a critical component of most of the conversations that we have with communities in this landscape. It's critical for food sovereignty and for the rights and responsibilities of the communities that live there. The impact assessment process, however, has been challenging, particularly around the Ring of Fire. There are issues with the federal IA, including a judicial review of the SIA decision for Cliffs Chromite project when that was still alive. And those issues led to the development of a regional framework agreement between the province of Ontario and 9 of the Matau First Nations that are directly over the site where the Ring of Fire mineral claims were shown there. There's been little or no attention to Indigenous-led processes by government or at any level, and limited capacity with First Nations to do more other than react. And I will just say that of the 4 objectives that were part of the regional framework, enhanced engagement in IA was one of those things, and that none of these objectives were actually led to any final outcomes that we could see. So the state of play today is we have 2 road projects going through project level IA at both the federal and the provincial level. These projects are being led by mining ready communities. They are scoped as typical projects and rarely linked to the social and economic components that are under consideration. That said, there is some regional consideration for caribou ranges, wolverine movement behavior, and some fisheries, but I think as we all know, it's really difficult to talk about cumulative effects and broader policy and regional impacts associated with those effects in project level IA. And I will just indicate too that there's potentially a 3rd road project impact assessment also coming along. While First Nations are the proponents for the purpose of the IA, it's Ontario that's actually funding and regulating these projects. And I'd be remiss to suggest that although the federal government's been doing an excellent job of trying to engage with communities all around the region as well as downstream, there's a lot of challenges and discord between communities about both the road projects as well as the broader impacts and their engagement in impact assessment. So as an organization that spent many years advocating for and making the scientific case for a regional impact assessment, it wasn't until the Impact Assessment Act came along that there was finally an opportunity to consider regional assessment. As and that was actually delivered in February of 2020 for the Ring of Fire. There are challenges though. This is potentially another process in which communities need to find time, space, energy, and resources to engage. It's largely disconnected from those 3 projects that I showed you on the map. Well, 2 projects, but potentially a 3rd coming along. And there's actually very limited expertise, both natural and scientific, social, in terms of being able to engage with these processes. The engagement has also been limited, obviously, because of COVID. This is a bit of a detour, but I did want to just call out to the Far North Act, which has been recently reviewed and repealed. But there were some communities that were engaged in this planning process to decide where areas could be developed and where areas needed to be protected. And it was being reviewed in 2019, leaving some communities in various states of planning processes. It's unclear how that information is actually being included in impact assessment and where or when it's going to be used in making other decisions about land use in the region. The bigger issue with the Far North Act is obviously that there's no more funding for Far North research, science, or monitoring. And my last slide is just some final thoughts. As obviously with this project, whatever the project is in the Ring of Fire, whether it's a mining project or a number of roads to get to those mines, the real obstacles have really been low commodity prices, the need for significant government subsidies to provide access and get into those regions, but more importantly, the need for an equitable process with the First Nations to whom the lands, the waters, and wildlife are tied and critical for both the future of this region for all of us. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Cheryl, for that presentation. So now we'll turn it to Steve DeRoy.
I was muted. Classic blunder. Thank you very much. My name's Steve DeRoy. I'm from the Buffalo clan and from Manitoba, a place called Ebb and Flow in Lake Man. My traditional name is Water Drum Man. I'm a Sundance chief, and I'm also a cartographer, an Indigenous cartographer. I've been acted as an expert witness, and I've been working in this field for the past 22 years. About a decade ago, I founded a company with some friends called the Firelight Group. We thought it would be fun to work together, and we didn't realize the impact of having an Indigenous-owned consultancy working specifically for Indigenous communities, what that could do. But I also serve with many other hats. I'm a board member at the West Coast Environmental Law, a member of the Google Earth Outreach Trainers Network. I'm an advisor to the Metcalfe Foundation, and I have a Master's of Science from University College of London. Oh, wrong button here. I've got to find my advanced, there it is. So Firelight is an Indigenous-owned company. We were established to work primarily for Indigenous communities only. And much of our work is designed to create and enhance community capacity wherever we're working. And we work in a number of fields. So the major part of the work that we do is within environmental assessment or impact assessment. We do a lot of the baseline studies. So we do a lot of traditional knowledge and use studies. We will do the health studies, the socio and economic impact assessments, and the ecological studies. And what underpins a lot of this work is the mapping and the long-term planning for Indigenous communities and negotiating a preferred future for Indigenous communities. And most of our work, I said, are focused in and around the impact assessment realm. And we've been very fortunate to be a leader in the realm of impact assessment. We've worked in pretty much every major project across the country and working with Indigenous communities to better understand what those rights-based activities are. We do a lot of work in the realm of rights-based assessments and access to cultural continuity, health, traditional foods and wild foods, the opportunities for governance and economic opportunities and certainty. So a lot of our work is driven by these initial baseline studies that help inform many of those other opportunities. And our research is really focused on what matters most to Indigenous communities. By switching the whole, like turning the table around and saying, well, let's get Indigenous communities to lead these processes. We're going to really discover that the things that we think are important are actually not necessarily important to those communities. That if we actually hand the pen back to the community and say, well, okay, well, you write this assessment, you lead this study, you drive the process, what kind of outcomes are going to be identified, and when by doing so, what happens is that we really get at the things that matter most. The community drives the process, decides what kind of research to focus on, and through that process, we train Indigenous community members to be engaged throughout the entire research process, so that when we're finished and we leave, at least there's that institutional knowledge at the community level for Indigenous communities to be able to continue that dialogue. Through this work, a lot of our work, as I said, is a capacity development approach. So we developed what's called a direct-to-digital mapping method, where we project a map image up onto the wall, and participants use a laser pointer and point to places on the map, and they identify those values that are important to them. And it's been through this process that this participatory mapping exercise that really gets at understanding the key issues relating to particular project components. There's a lot of different types of outcomes that would come through a kind of a rights-based assessment or rights-based research, or traditional knowledge and use study research, and from use and occupancy studies to harvest studies to Indigenous knowledge, looking at archaeology and the written ethnographies, or even looking at alienation studies, understanding where people used to go, but they can no longer go there due to infringements or barriers that are put in place. And so it's through this research that we really identified the need to increase those data quality metrics, where primarily this research used to just focus on the who, what, where, and when. We call those data diamonds. And through the direct-to-digital mapping method, we turned that data diamond to a data star, and looking at more of the Indigenous epistemologies and looking at the relational ecological kinship and Indigenous knowledge transfer aspects of that information. In 2000, I'm just going to give you an example. We've worked on probably 250 studies with Indigenous communities across the country, as I said. So this is just one example of the outputs. It was working with the Treaty 8 First Nations in northern British Columbia as it related to proposed BC Hydro Site C dam. And through this study, we interviewed 81 members from 4 First Nations, and documented and really used maps to tell a different story of space and place, and why those places mattered, and what would happen if that area was flooded, and connecting the dots essentially, so that people that were from the south, who may not necessarily be connected to the study, could at least understand that there is this connection, this longstanding connection to space and place. And so, so the work that we do supports Indigenous communities to use this information that are often project specific, and focus on these large scale impacts from industrial developments on those treaty and Aboriginal rights. So just a few examples: we worked on in the oil sands, looking at the decreasing water levels of the Athabasca River, and how that has an actual treaty impact to the First Nations in that area. Or we looked at the Saugeen Anishinaabe as it related to the Winnipeg River hydro dams, and what that meant for those communities that are affected by those hydro impacts, those long-term and multi-generational impacts that we're talking about. I mean, some of these dams were built over 100 years ago. So how does that reflect the reality? So how do we do this? Well, we document and describe the members' knowledge and values. We identify the who, what, where, when, why, and how of those members' access to those areas. And we document and connect the dots to the impacts of those various project components as they relate to and connect to those community values. Typically, we ask these types of questions relating to habitation, transportation, subsistence, cultural, environmental, and then we talk about what people think about the actual project, how they think it might impact the use of the lands and waters in those areas, and how it might affect future generations and access to those places. So the two outputs of these research activities really produced, one was a site-specific spatial element, which is like, at this point, this is what this value is. But the second part is the meat of it all. It's the narratives, it's that qualitative information, the descriptions of why those places matter. It's not just a dot on the map, but it's a connection to a broader practice of activities. And so these are typically some of the activities that we would do under these studies, and making sure that the proponent funds an adequate study that allow for the Indigenous community to actually be engaged, be able to participate in the process, be able to inform impact assessment, and be able to at least ensure that their rights-based activities are protected into the future. So I don't know, I haven't been keeping track of time, but I've been talking very fast. If you want to know more, come to my session. I'd love to explore these questions further. So miigwech.
That's great. Thank you so much, Steve. All right, and last but not least, we have Dr. Gwendolyn Blue.
And just I guess in keeping, I had to also talk while I was muted. But thank you everyone for the opportunity to present in this panel. And my role is to summarize some of the discussions that we've had, and also to put forward a proposition that justice, and particularly lessons from the environmental justice frameworks, can help us to understand how impact assessments can be used to realize sustainable development goals. And to do this, I am going to focus on a recent research project that looked at how justice is framed within the environmental impact assessment literature. So my argument is that justice is fundamental to impact assessments insofar as these assessments and the decisions that are made are about good and bad, right and wrong, with and without others in relation to particular places. And these decisions are made often in the face of bitter public contestation. In turn, the claims for justice are increasingly part of conflicts over industrial development, whether explicitly through protest movements or implicitly through claims about whether or not development or plans in general are the right thing to do. Before I get started, though, I would like to make an acknowledgement first to my co-conspirators, co-authors on this project, Dr. Kelly Bronson from the University of Ottawa and Alana LaJoy McNally, also from the University of Calgary, for whom none of this work would have been possible. So unfortunately, they're not able to be with us, but I would like to at least acknowledge their contributions. Second, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Personally, I descend from 4 generations of settlers to this region who came from Europe and the United States. And this is just a picture of some of the land that my grandparents occupy, and that I grew up very close to this land. I have lived in this region for a large portion of my life, and in many ways, my thinking and my interests in environmental governance have come from places like this. I also want to acknowledge the words of Reg Croshu, who is a traditional knowledge keeper in residence at the University of Calgary. Our laws come from the land, and our practices of granting rights and privileges is a process we were born with that ties us to this land. I think that this statement is of utmost significance for questions of justice in ways that call for deeper thinking and analysis on the part of settler colonial institutions and those of us who were trained within those institutions. My aim here is not at all to offer any solutions or answers, but what I'm hoping is that in proposing a framework of justice, that we can raise questions about IA processes and practices that hopefully can open conversation that are in line with the spirit of these words. I would like to say also that I am not trained as an IA scholar, but that my work is situated within cultural studies and science and technology studies traditions. And most of my work and scholarship to date is focused on public deliberation with science and technology. And it's from that work that I've come to realize the importance of justice and as a framework for thinking about how we might come together for more equitable aims. So considerations of justice underpin next generation impact assessments and sustainable development, for which meaningful engagement with diverse ways of knowing is central. Globally, impact assessments have been in place for over 40 years and are practiced in some form in most of the world's nations. IA is a form of anticipatory governance insofar as it seeks to understand the consequences of a proposed project, could also be a plan or a policy, prior to the decision to move forward with the proposed action. As numerous commentators have noted, however, environmental decision-making typically proceeds without due and full consideration of justice. For example, justice is not currently an explicitly stated guiding principle in environmental decision-making and sustainable development commitments in Canada. And yet, justice is central to key values in next generation impact assessment. And I'm just going to give you just a couple of examples. The one is from the Building Common Ground, a new vision for impact assessment in Canada, which was a expert panel report that was commissioned and released in 2017. And we see here values such as transparency, inclusion, and informed and meaningful decision-making processes. The Canadian government is also deeply committed to sustainable development as a way to promote clean growth, ensure healthy ecosystems, and build safe, secure, and sustainable communities. Now, like democracy, the concept of justice can be intangible and ambiguous and open to multiple definitions. So it's important to start with at least a working definition. For the purposes of this presentation and for our research, we define justice in ways that align with environmental justice scholarship and activism. And we consider justice as comprising three interrelated areas. Most understandings of environmental justice highlight issues of distribution, and by distribution of economic costs or benefits, as well as environmental harms or benefits. This definition of justice as distribution, for instance, is enshrined in the United States Environmental Protection Agency's description of the goal of environmental justice to ensure that all people, regardless of race, national origin, or income, are protected from the disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards. However, reducing justice just to issues of distribution is incomplete. As most activist communities and NGOs have argued, it is important also to consider issues of representation and recognition. So by recognition, I mean mostly issues of procedural fairness, such as processes of consultation, the ability to shape decisions, who has influence, who has access to information and entitlement to take part in decision-making and review processes. So here we also can consider public engagement and participation, also ways in which people can contribute to knowledge development through things like citizen science, as well as the ways in which issues are framed. By issues of recognition, we mean the cultural dimensions of justice. And here we're extending discussions of framing to include acknowledgement and respect for diverse cultural identities, practices, worldviews, and knowledge. So injustice can take shape in environmental decision-making through stereotypes, disrespect, and discrimination directed towards groups, and particularly marginalized groups, by those in positions of power. This graph is a summary of our recent research and our findings. And I'll just give you a brief overview of this and what it is that I wanted to draw from this research. This was a scoping review in which we looked at the broad global literature on impact assessment, and we were interested to find out how was it that the discussions of justice were taking place in that literature. And we organize this in terms of those dimensions that I talked about on the previous slide. So to what extent are issues of distribution discussed? To what extent are issues of representation and recognition discussed? We also were interested in where these discussions were taking place and to what extent these issues were developed. So you'll see just an overview of our methods, and I will give you a source if you're interested in this at the end of the presentation. What we found was that issues of representation were largely the most addressed. About 76% of the literature addressed issues of representation. Relatively frequently, issues of distribution were discussed, and less frequently, issues of recognition were discussed. Now, viewed geographically, this overview is more nuanced, and we can see how justice was conceived across different parts of the world with this slide. What I want to draw your attention to is Canada. Canada was unique insofar as our sum of recognition is higher proportionally to other discussions. And so we feel that there's a great deal of important information that could come out for justice, and particularly looking at this understanding of recognition. I'm just going to pull, for sake of time, 2 findings from this, particularly as focused within the Canadian IA literature around issues of recognitional justice. So the focus, what we found within this small domain, was how to include diverse knowledge into environmental management and assessment processes, with a particular emphasis on Indigenous knowledges. And the literature summed up, addressed 2 key themes. One was the challenges and shortcomings of previous environmental impact assessment efforts to treat different knowledge systems on an equal basis. And so there is an acknowledgement that it is still challenging at that governance level to address these issues of equity, and particularly because there's unequal power relations. The dominant worldviews and values held by those in power in terms of designing and executing impact assessments are often inconsistent with Indigenous knowledge holders and Indigenous communities more broadly. There's also a potential for exploitation or tokenistic relationships between IA practices and Indigenous knowledge that warrants attention. The new impact assessment, next generation impact assessment in Canada, is committed to evidence-based decisions reflecting the best available science, Indigenous knowledge, and community knowledge. So we're on a good footing in order for addressing some of these justice challenges. However, I do want to address some potential issues. One is indeficiencies in science informing IA. And just a couple of references here of some of those deficiencies. This includes not specifically how that is that the science is addressed, but much more the context for science. Cheryl had addressed this in her presentation, but I will also just situate this within the literature, and this coming from the article by Westwood and colleagues. The context for science was excessively discretionary government powers, failure to tackle challenges of cumulative environmental effects, as well as a lack of a strong commitment to open, rigorous, and impartial science, and potentially even social science as well. Often the results are geared towards industry. So a key question that I want to leave us with is, how can we ensure that diverse types of knowledge inform impact assessments? Evidence-based decision-making is necessary but insufficient. And this is where I think that justice can help us think through some of these challenges. So again, I'm not going to leave with any answers, but rather some questions guided by these different domains of justice. In terms of representation, who decides what constitutes valid knowledge? According to which processes, traditions, standards, and criteria? And here I think we have a great deal to learn from the processes that Steve has discussed, and how those can be scaled up and also inform other processes throughout Canada. Recognition, what knowledge is recognized and what knowledge is not recognized? How do we overcome the divisions that have been put in place by settler colonial institutions? And distribution, whose knowledge production receives funding and support, and whose knowledge production then is not given that type of support. So thank you so much. This is, if you're interested in our fuller report, this is a reference for you. I look forward to further conversations in the breakout room. And I hope that I have managed to stay within the time frame.
Yes, you did. And thank you so much for that excellent presentation. Thanks to all our speakers. I think those were so interesting and thought-provoking, and there were a lot of common strands that went across all of those presentations. So as I said, now it's time for the breakout groups. And so just to remind you of the process, if you would like to choose a breakout group to discuss a presentation further with a speaker, you need to click on your image in Zoom. You'll see 3 dots appear, and then you can click on rename and just add a number in front of your name, 1, 2, 3, or 4. So we have 1, Ian Stewart, 2, Cheryl Chetkiewicz, 3, Steve DeRoy, and 4, Gwendolyn Blue. If you're not sure or you're having trouble with the Zoom technology, that's okay. The conference organizers are going to just assign you to a session randomly. But if you do want to make a selection, I encourage you to do that right now.
Miriam, can I just jump in quickly? Just panelists, please be ready to share at the end when we come back together, when we're brought back together into the plenary. Please be ready to share 1 or 2 thoughts that you think captures the conversation that you've had in your rooms, so that we can just have a kind of summing up, and 1 or 2, or if there's too many, then you use your discretion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ian. Yeah, so we'll have about 20 minutes for those breakout sessions, and then we'll come back to the plenary, and we'll have about 10 minutes to wrap up all together. And please do come back, because that will be your chance to hear what was discussed in the other breakout groups, and they'll be summarized, as Ian said, by the different leaders of each session. Okay, so I'm going to let the conference technology people go ahead, and if you have seen numbers assigned, please go ahead and assign the people to those breakout rooms, and otherwise you'll just be assigned at random, and that's fine as well, and we'll see you back in the plenary session in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'll just take 30 more seconds to let people switch over from the breakout groups. I hope you had a good discussion in each room. I think at least in our group, we found we could have used some more time, but hopefully we made some connections with each other, and that the dialogue can continue. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to our 4 speakers, and each one is going to share some reflections or kind of key takeaways from the discussion that happened in their breakout group. And we'll just follow the same order as we did with the presentation. So we'll start with Ian Stewart.
Yeah, apologies, Bruce, that you got cut off in the mid-sentence. So we essentially were thinking, there were quite a number of people from government and to some extent university, and but generally people interested in the question of how SDGs are connecting up with impact assessment. And there's a general agreement that there's obviously a need to do that, but probably SDGs are themselves, and the apparatus, the UN apparatus around that, is too cumbersome to implement in every impact assessment, but rather it's a question of the spirit versus the letter of SDGs. But also questions about how will the humanities and social sciences be brought forward in a meaningful way that is of use to not just the government, but of proponents' work in impact assessment. So, I'm coming away with a number of thoughts, and mostly I want to say that I was really grateful for the people that joined the room, insofar as we're in the process of building a network of people. I feel like I've just added some great names that I want to reach out to for the sake of this network. So thanks to all of those of you who joined.
Thanks, Ian. So my room obviously were clearly people that wanted to talk about the Ring of Fire and wanted to know who I was and what we were doing and where we've been. And so we didn't actually even get around to talking about sustainable development goals, I'm very sorry, and the role of humanities. But we did talk about what science has been conducted, what science information is available, and then some of the just general ideas around project versus regional impact assessments. So I'm very grateful for the folks that joined, and I think most of them were government. So I think there's real interest in just knowing more about the area and better understanding of what's available in terms of the science and research there. So I tried to provide a bit more context. People did ask for my email so that they could get in touch about regional assessment, and I did allude to a number of reports that are on our website. So even though it didn't really come across my presentation, we've done quite a bit on cumulative effects on freshwater fish, and a number of exercises around caribou and wolverine in terms of modeling and statistical assessments. So those are all available, publicly available, and may be of interest to some of the other people on this call as well. That's it. Thank you.
Hi, folks. I was just typing a message, and it was in my brain. Anyway, I just wanted to. We actually had a really fun session. We did what's called a Jamboard. I used this tool called Jamboards, and I posed a number of questions to our group so that people all had a voice. So there wasn't just one voice coming through. So you can see I asked some questions. What are some of the different contributions to knowledge about impact, and how can different voices be contributing? These are some of the thoughts. The next question we had was, how can Indigenous knowledge achieve sustainable development goals? We skipped that because it was too broad. But are there barriers to incorporating Indigenous knowledge into impact assessment? If so, what are they? We got a lot of engagement, lack of Indigenous knowledge, or engagement with Indigenous communities. The IA process is too rigid, a mistrust of government bureaucratic processes. IA favors quantifiable data, not knowing what questions to ask or to solicit in IK, not understanding IK in the first place. And then we had some questions about what are some of the ways we can give Indigenous peoples a voice in impact assessment, and having multiple perspectives, funding, engagement, Indigenous-led assessments, public and consultation engagement sessions. Lots of engagement. We heard a lot about that. How can we do a better job of connecting people to place, land-based education early on, getting people right out there on the land, ensuring that the government staff and decision makers are actually going to those places and talking to people in those places, listen to people who live on the lands, really talk to people. That really came through in one of the points. And then how can impact assessments be opportunities to sustainable developments? There's a few opportunities that emerged, assigning greater value to how people navigate their environments, ensuring we have an holistic approach to IA, and in providing proof that sustainable development goals are essential. And then what are some of the barriers? We had one that at the end of the day, the public interest determination and ministerial decision may not necessarily contribute to sustainable development. That was an important point. And how can social science and humanities scholars help? And these are some of the ways: becoming a mentor, be an ally, bridge ways of thinking, be the change. It was really great to hear everyone's perspectives. And with that, that was our panel. So I tried to jam a lot into a very little bit of time.
Have you kept a record of those, Steve?
I do, yes. I'll be sure to share it with you.
I guess I'm next. Thank you for that, Steve. I love that Jamboard. So it's nice to see it use. I just found out about it, so it's always so exciting. Like, oh, should have used that one. But we had a wonderful conversation, and thank you to everyone who was in my panel. It was much too short of a time, and I will try to summarize our key themes hopefully in ways that do justice to our conversation. Sorry for the pun. Most of our conversations were focused around these tensions with knowledge systems, and particularly the power that science has and the opportunities for change. There was a recognition of tensions, but also a recognition of some transformations that have happened, and those transformations happening at three levels: cultural, political, and economic. And so I think that we have had a big space to cover quite a bit of ground. There was a lot of recognition of Steve's presentation as some ideas for how we can make some practical changes in terms of protests. And I would add also Cheryl's work on cumulative effects and regional assessments were also really important. So it's great I don't want to be the person who's always just addressing the problems, but also really nice to have some look at what some of these solutions are happening. So I think in Canada, we can be very, very proud of ourselves in terms of the work that's happening, while still recognizing the need for change. Some of the conversation was around the state of the relation between Indigenous knowledge versus Western knowledge, in particular barriers in science, the focus on data, statistics, and publications, and how does that then align with an acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge as holistic, as land-based and place-based, and what kinds of shifts are necessary. We also talked to the IA process about the need for planning in that planning stage. So thank you, Ian, for that wonderful graphic at the start that really helped us to think about those different stages of IA. It's a complicated process. And the need for strategic thinking and conceptual thinking. And again, to really recognize the big tasks that are at hand. So thanks again, everyone.
I've just shared the link for the Jamboard. So if people want to go there and even contribute more to the art panel, feel free to do that. I unfortunately need to get going.
Thanks for that, Steve. That's a great technology for getting input in a breakout session like that. Well, I really want to thank our 4 panelists very much for participating in the session today and sharing your perspectives. I think from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada perspective that, we're learning a lot as we're going through the implementation of this new impact assessment process and thinking about the links to sustainability. So we really appreciate, the different ways that you approach the topic. And I know personally, I learned a lot from participating in the session today. And thanks also to the participants for joining us. So I see several people have left their email addresses in the chat, so feel free to get in touch, and I know they would all be interested in hearing from you if you have further comments or questions. And with that, I think that concludes our session. Thank you so much.
Chetkiewicz, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
We'll chat later in the week, everybody, panel members.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ian, for inviting
Bye.
us.
Hey, thank you for coming. Lovely.